Daniel Foster stared at the glowing words on his laptop screen, his chest tightening with every line. Dad, I don't think it's a good idea for you to come to the wedding. It might be better if you watched through the live stream. He read it again. Then a third time. No. Thank you? No explanation. Just a cold dismissal from his only daughter, Emily, the same daughter whose dream wedding he was making a reality with his own life savings. Daniel had been a single father since Emily was 10. He had missed vacations, worked extra hours, and even dipped into his retirement fund just to make her big day perfect. And now? He wasn't welcome. Daniel didn't reply. He didn't beg. He didn't call his ex-wife to argue. Instead, he closed the email, sat back in his chair, and whispered to himself. All right, Emily. If that's what you want. But what Emily didn't know was that her father had one final surprise planned, one that would change the wedding, and her life, forever. Daniel Foster wasn't a perfect man, but he had always been a devoted father. When his wife walked out 15 years ago, leaving him with a confused 10-year-old daughter and a pile of unpaid bills, Daniel didn't hesitate. He worked double shifts as a construction supervisor, fixed up cars on weekends, and took side jobs whenever he could. Vacations? Gone. New clothes? Only when absolutely necessary. Every extra dollar went toward raising Emily. He packed her school lunches, sat in the bleachers at every soccer game, and stayed up late quizzing her for exams, even when his hands were raw from 12 hours of lifting steel beams. He told himself the sacrifices would pay off. And in many ways they did. Emily grew into a bright, ambitious woman. She got into a good college, made friends easily, and seemed destined for a happy life. Daniel watched with quiet pride, always thinking, this is why I worked so hard. This is why I gave everything. So when Emily got engaged, Daniel was determined to make her wedding magical. To give her that magic, he didn't hesitate to transfer $30,000 from his retirement savings, money he had set aside after decades of hard labor. It wasn't money he could easily replace, but he didn't care. He wanted his daughter to feel cherished, to have the kind of wedding her mother never gave him. But as planning went on, something shifted. Emily grew distant. Phone calls became shorter. Decisions were made without him. He noticed her fiancé, Tyler, sneering whenever Daniel asked simple questions about the budget. Even Emily's mother, who had suddenly reappeared in the picture, seemed to have more say in the guest list than Daniel did. Still, Daniel stayed quiet. He told himself it was just wedding stress. He told himself Emily still loved him. But the email proved otherwise. Late at night, as the glow of the laptop faded and silence filled his kitchen, Daniel felt a truth he had ignored for years pressing down on him. He had given everything to a daughter who now saw him as disposable. And in that moment, a seed of resolve took root. The following week, Daniel drove across town to drop off some documents Emily had left at his house. He thought maybe, just maybe, she would soften when she saw him in person. But when he arrived, the door was opened not by Emily, but by Tyler, her fiancé. Tyler leaned casually against the frame, his expensive shirt unbuttoned one too many notches, his smirk as sharp as a knife. Well, if it isn't the bank, Tyler said. Didn't think you'd show up uninvited. Daniel froze, the single word echoing in his mind. The bank? After all these years, that's all he was to them. Emily appeared behind him, her eyes darting from Tyler back to her father, refusing to meet his gaze. Dad, you didn't have to come. I told you I'd pick those up. Her voice was clipped, almost embarrassed, as if Daniel's presence was an inconvenience. Inside, Daniel caught a glimpse of his ex-wife, Sharon, sipping wine on the couch like she belonged there. She had barely lifted a finger in Emily's upbringing, but now she sat comfortably in the role of mother of the bride. The conversation that followed was short and humiliating. Emily insisted the wedding would run more smoothly without Daniel. Sharon added with false sweetness that maybe he'd get emotional and embarrass everyone. Tyler didn't bother with subtlety, he outright said Daniel's blue-collar vibe didn't fit with the image they wanted for the wedding. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He had signed the checks. He had written, Foster, on every receipt. And now they were telling him to watch his daughter's wedding from a screen like a stranger. He tried to ask Emily directly, "Is this what you really want?" Her answer was a whisper, barely audible. "Yes, Dad." The door shut before he could say another word. Driving home, Daniel's hands trembled on the steering wheel. He wasn't angry yet, he was stunned. For years, he had pictured walking Emily down the aisle, giving her away with tears in his eyes. Now that moment had been stolen. Not by accident, but by people who believed his love, and his money, came with no conditions. They thought he would swallow his pride, sit quietly in front of a live stream, and still pay the bills. But for the first time in his life, Daniel began to wonder, what if I didn't? Daniel sat alone in his small living room, the glow of the wedding binder still spread across his coffee table. He had been the one to gather brochures, compare venues, and even negotiate with caterers. Every receipt bore his signature, every deposit came from his account. And yet, he wouldn't even be allowed to sit in the pews. For the first time in years, Daniel let the silence around him sink in. The house felt colder than ever. Emily's childhood photos lined the mantel, Emily with missing front teeth holding a soccer trophy, Emily grinning in her prom dress while Daniel adjusted her corsage. He had been there for every milestone. So why was he being erased now? He clenched his fists, then loosened them. Anger burned in his chest, but under it was something worse, doubt. Had he smothered Emily with his devotion? Had he made mistakes he couldn't see? Was she ashamed of him? The worn hands, the callous voice, the cheap suit he wore to every important event? For years, Daniel had told himself that sacrifice was love. That being invisible, quiet, and dependable was enough. But now he wondered, was I just a wallet? Was I ever truly her father in her eyes? He imagined himself sitting alone on the day of the wedding, watching his daughter marry a man who despised him, listening to vows he'd never hear in person. His chest tightened at the thought. Part of him wanted to call Emily to beg. Another part wanted to storm over and demand respect. But he did neither. He sat still, staring at the dark window, his reflection looking older and more tired than he remembered. And then, a quiet thought pierced through the noise. What if this isn't about losing her? What if this is about finding myself? For the first time in a long while, Daniel wasn't just a father. He was a man, one who had been pushed aside, underestimated, and quietly taken for granted. And men like that? They didn't stay silent forever. A week later, Daniel received an email from the wedding coordinator. She was confused. There seemed to be an issue with one of the final payments. The caterer's $6,000 balance hadn't gone through. Daniel smiled for the first time in days. Of course it hadn't gone through. He had quietly cancelled the auto transfers from his bank the night after Emily's email. He had set up every major vendor under his name, his account, his card. Without him, the wedding didn't move forward. For once, the silence was his. Emily called that evening, her voice sharp. "Dad, the caterer says the payment didn't clear. Did something happen?" Daniel kept his tone calm. "Yes. I stopped the payments." There was a pause, then a rush of panic. "You can't just do that. We're days away from the wedding." Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. "You told me I wasn't welcome. If that's the case, then neither is my money." For a moment, there was silence on the line. Then came the sound of Tyler in the background, his voice dripping with venom. "See? I told you he'd pull something like this." Emily hissed. "Dad, please. Don't ruin this for me. Just finish the payments. You don't even have to show up." Daniel's heart twisted. Even in her desperation, she didn't ask him to come, only to pay. But still, this was a small victory. For once, they needed him. For once, his absence mattered. He ended the call without agreeing to anything. That night, Daniel allowed himself a flicker of hope. Maybe Emily would realize how much he'd done. Maybe she would see that her wedding, her future, had been built on his sacrifices. But hope is fragile. The very next morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from Sharon's attorney. Buried under polite legal phrases was a demand. Since Daniel had gifted the money, he was legally bound to fulfill all agreed payments for the wedding. The trap had been set long before he even knew there was a game. And just like that, his small victory began to crumble. Daniel sat at the long oak table in the attorney's office, staring at the thick packet of papers spread before him. Every page was another nail in the coffin of his pride. The letter hadn't been a bluff. Sharon and Tyler had worked with Emily to draw up contracts in Daniel's name. He remembered Emily rushing him to sign the initial venue deposit, saying it was just a formality to hold the date. He hadn't read the fine print, he had simply trusted his daughter. Now he saw they had listed him not as a guarantor, but as the sole primary responsible party. Legally, the wedding debt was his, whether he showed up or not. It was clever. Ruthless. And it left him no choice but to finish paying. By the end of the week, Daniel's retirement savings were gutted. The money he had spent decades building, gone in an instant. His future traded away for a wedding he wasn't invited to. The humiliation didn't stop there. At the rehearsal dinner, he drove past the venue out of habit, just to see it. Through the windows, he caught sight of Emily glowing in her white dress, Tyler boasting with a glass of champagne in hand, and Sharon holding court with relatives Daniel hadn't spoken to in years. He stood outside in the dark, watching through the glass like an outsider. Then it happened. Tyler raised his glass and laughed loudly enough for Daniel to hear through the open door. "Here's to Emily's real family, the ones who belong here." The room erupted in cheers. A cold numbness spread through Daniel's chest. He didn't just feel unseen, he felt completely and utterly replaced. For years he had been the one steady figure in Emily's life. And now, at her most important moment, she toasted another man's name and another woman's legacy. He drove home in silence, the night pressing heavy around him. His hands shook on the wheel, not from rage but from emptiness. By the time he stepped into his house, he knew what he was: erased. No seat at the table. No father of the bride's speech. No recognition for the sacrifices he had made. All he had left was an empty bank account and a hollow title, Dad, in name only. And in that crushing silence, Daniel realized something. They had taken everything. Which meant he had nothing left to lose. The morning after the rehearsal dinner, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and a silence so heavy it felt like a presence. His house was small, modest, worn down by years of long hours and forgotten self-care. The paint on the walls peeled in places. His hands were still calloused, stained with the marks of a man who had spent a lifetime working. And yet, despite the fatigue, he felt something different stirring in him: clarity. He thought back to the moment Emily was born, when he held her tiny frame and promised her he would always protect her. He had kept that promise. But protecting her had turned into enabling her, until she no longer saw him as a father, only as a provider. He opened the drawer of his desk and pulled out the binder he had used for all the wedding contracts. For weeks, it had been a reminder of loss. But now, as he flipped through each page, his eyes sharpened. Every receipt bore his name. Every contract was tied to his account. Every payment had gone through him. He had no seat at the wedding, true, but without him, there would have been no wedding at all. Daniel leaned back, exhaling slowly. Revenge didn't have to be loud. It didn't have to be cruel. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge was silence, letting others face the weight of their choices without the safety net they'd grown used to. He took out a pen and began writing a letter. Not to Emily. Not to Sharon. To the vendors. To the people who actually held the power. The decision was simple, almost liberating. He would no longer fight for a place at a table where he wasn't wanted. But he would make sure they understood just how much they had lost when they decided to cast him aside. By the time he finished the letter, Daniel felt something he hadn't in weeks: calm. They thought they had broken him. But really, they had just freed him. Daniel didn't storm into the venue. He didn't shout. He didn't even tell Emily what he was doing. Instead, he drove calmly into town the morning of the wedding and walked into the bank where he had set up every vendor account. He handed the teller a neat stack of papers, the letters he had written the night before. "I'd like to revoke all authorizations linked to these contracts," he said firmly. The teller scanned the documents, glanced at Daniel's ID, and nodded. "Yes, sir. We can process that immediately." It was that simple. By noon, the florist, the photographer, and even the live band had received cancellation notices. The hotel catering staff was alerted that their contract holder was no longer guaranteeing payment. Legally, Daniel wasn't breaking the agreements. He was exercising his right as the sole financial backer to withdraw. And suddenly, the perfect wedding Sharon and Tyler had built on his shoulders began to tremble. Words spread quickly. The photographer left a curt voicemail demanding new payment before showing up. The band posted on social media that they'd been stood up by the Foster wedding. And the caterer, furious, threatened to pull out entirely. For the first time, Sharon's carefully curated image cracked. Tyler's smug confidence faltered. Emily, caught in the middle, began calling Daniel nonstop. But Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he sat in his truck near the venue, watching from a distance. He saw the frantic pacing, the whispered arguments, the forced smiles slipping from Sharon's face as guests began to whisper. Tyler stormed outside at one point, yanking at his tie and shouting into his phone. His polished, arrogant facade was gone, replaced with panic. Daniel's lips curled into a thin, quiet smile. For once, the man who had sneered at him now looked small. They wanted him erased. But on the day of the wedding, his absence was the loudest thing in the room. By the time the ceremony was set to begin, the cracks in Emily's perfect wedding had become impossible to ignore. The florist never arrived. The band refused to set up. Guests were left sitting in folding chairs under half-decorated arches, murmuring about the chaos. Sharon barked orders at the hotel staff like a general losing a battle, while Tyler paced back and forth, his face red with fury. And then came the final blow. Minutes before Emily was supposed to walk down the aisle, the hotel manager approached Sharon with a clipboard. His voice was polite but firm. "Mrs. Foster, without full payment, the reception hall is no longer available for your party. We'll need you and your guests to vacate immediately after the ceremony." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The whispers grew louder. Emily, standing in her gown, turned pale. Tyler exploded. "What do you mean, no reception? This is a six-figure wedding." The manager shook his head. "Not without funds." And the account holder cancelled. Everyone turned toward Emily. "Who's the account holder?" a relative asked loudly. Before she could answer, Daniel appeared. Calm. Silent. Standing at the back of the room in a plain black suit, arms crossed. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Isn't that her father? Why wasn't he here before?" Emily's eyes filled with tears as she locked onto him. For the first time, she seemed to understand. Her father hadn't abandoned her. He had carried everything. And now, without him, it was all collapsing. Daniel didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. Tyler sneered across the aisle, his voice cracking with panic. "This is your fault, old man." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "No, son. This is the cost of removing the foundation you were standing on." The room fell silent. Emily broke down, sobbing into her bouquet as the weight of her choices pressed down harder than any vow. And with quiet dignity, Daniel turned and walked away, leaving the wedding, the debt, and the broken illusions behind. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, the late summer sun warming his face. For the first time in years, he felt no weight pressing on his shoulders. The retirement savings were gone, yes, but so was the burden of being treated like a man whose love had no limits. The wedding had gone forward in fragments. Guests whispered about the chaos. Photos circulated online of Emily's reception being held in a cramped restaurant down the road after the hotel kicked them out. Tyler's business contacts, who had flown in expecting an elegant evening, left unimpressed. Sharon's carefully constructed image as the devoted mother had been shattered in front of everyone she knew. And Emily? She hadn't called. Not once. Daniel wasn't sure if she ever would. But he knew one thing: he had given her everything he could as a father. What she chose to do with that was no longer his responsibility. For once, he wasn't defined by being the fixer, the provider, or the invisible backbone of someone else's happiness. He was just Daniel Foster, flawed, tired, but finally free. As the evening breeze rustled through the trees, he whispered a thought that had been forming since the night of the email. He finally understood a truth that had taken a lifetime to learn: love given without respect isn't a gift, it's just fuel for exploitation. He didn't regret raising Emily. He didn't regret the years of sacrifice. But he finally understood that being a parent didn't mean letting yourself be erased. Sometimes, the most powerful act of love is knowing when to stop giving. Daniel leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in decades, he wasn't living for someone else's approval. And that, he realized, was the sweetest kind of revenge. What did you think of Daniel's decision? If you enjoyed this story of karma, please consider liking and subscribing for more. Let us know in the comments what you would have done in his shoes.